In the late winter of 1879, a country doctor named Henrik Vogel was called urgently to a farmhouse outside the village of Weidendorf in the Eastern Hill Country, where he delivered a newborn child weighing 26 pounds and measuring just under 31 inches in length. The mother, a 34-year-old woman named Aletta Vogel, who was no relation to the doctor despite the shared name, died of internal hemorrhage 40 minutes after the birth. In those 40 minutes, between the cutting of the cord and the final breath, she dictated to the doctor a statement that he transcribed into the back of his medical register in a tight, careful hand. The statement ran to 9 pages. It described, in plain and unhurried language, the lineage from which her child had come, the reason that lineage had survived in hiding for almost 2 centuries, and the specific arrangement of names, estates, and ledgers in 3 European capitals that had been responsible for the systematic extermination of every previous child, like the one now lying in the cradle beside her bed. The doctor finished writing as her hand went cold. He closed the register. He carried it home in the inner pocket of his greatcoat. He did not show it to another living person for the next 43 years. And the reason he did not, as he later wrote in a private letter recovered from a sealed estate file in 1981, was that within 6 days of the birth, 3 of the witnesses present at that delivery had died of what the local coroner described as a sudden and unrelated influenza, and Dr. Vogel had understood, with the clarity of a man who reads the obvious for the first time, that the official version of how the modern world came into being was being protected by people who had no objection to small, quiet, well-spaced funerals. Before we go any further, if you are someone who suspects that the polished version of history they teach in schools leaves out the most important parts, then subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell, because everything we cover here challenges the official record. Now let us return to what Dr. Vogel wrote down at the bedside of a dying woman in the winter of 1879. Henrik Vogel was 47 years old in the spring. He was called to that farmhouse. He had practiced medicine in the same district for 19 years. He had delivered, by his own meticulous count kept in the front leaves of his register, 2,416 children in that period. He had seen large babies before. The largest in his prior experience had weighed 14.5 pounds, and that child had been the source of regional gossip for almost a decade. The child he delivered in February of 1879 weighed almost twice that figure. He recorded the weight 3 times because he did not initially trust his own scale. He recorded the length twice, against a folding wooden rule he kept in his bag. He noted that the infant was perfectly formed, with no swelling, no fluid retention, no indication of any of the conditions that occasionally produced abnormally heavy births. The child was simply, by every measurement Vogel could take, the proportions of a 6-year-old child compressed into the form of a newborn. The skull, the limbs, the chest cavity, the spacing of the eyes, the structure of the hands. Everything was scaled up by a uniform factor. The child cried with a voice that Vogel described in his notes as resembling the lower register of a young woman rather than the thin cry of a newborn. And the child opened its eyes within the first minute of life and held the doctor's gaze with what Vogel could only describe, in a margin note added later, as recognition. The mother had concealed the pregnancy for its full duration. She had lived alone in the farmhouse for 11 years, since the death of her husband, a quiet man named Peter Vogel, who had been a cartwright and who had died of a respiratory illness in the winter of 1868. She had received no visitors that anyone in the village could recall. She had purchased flour, salt, oil, and occasional small quantities of meat from the village merchant, but had grown most of her own food on a small holding of perhaps 4 acres. She had attended church on the major feast days, but had spoken to almost no one. When the doctor was finally summoned, it was by a passing peddler who had stopped at the farmhouse to sell needles and had heard her cries through the door. The peddler had ridden 2 hours to the nearest village to fetch help. By the time Vogel arrived, the child was already partway born, and the mother had already begun to bleed in a way that no village midwife of that period could have stopped. What Aletta Vogel told the doctor in her last 40 minutes was this. She was, she said, the last surviving carrier of a bloodline that had been preserved in deliberate isolation for almost 200 years. The line had once been numerous. It had once been, in her phrasing, the natural inheritance of certain valleys in the central and eastern part of the continent. Her ancestors had not been giants in the sense that storybooks use the word. They had been, on average, between 7 and 8 feet in height, with long bones, deep chests, and a slower rate of aging than the surrounding population. They had lived to be 120, 130, in some recorded cases 150 years old. They had not been a separate species. They had been, she said, an older and slower variant of the same family of humans, one that had survived the great resets of the previous millennium by retreating into specific high valleys and maintaining careful marriage networks that preserved their distinctive traits. The infants born to this line were always large, the adults were always tall, and the line, she said, had been deliberately and systematically hunted down between roughly the year 1680 and the year 1800 by a network of investigators working under the authority of 3 royal commissions, 2 ecclesiastical inquiries, and a quietly funded private association of merchant bankers based in the great trading cities of the north and the west. The reason for the extermination, she told the doctor, was not religious. It was not racial in any sense that the 19th century would have understood. It was not driven by superstition or fear of difference. It was driven by inheritance law. Her people, she said, were the living evidence of a much older system of land tenure. The valleys they had inhabited had been held under arrangements that predated the feudal contracts. Their long lifespans meant that a single individual could remember, in unbroken personal recollection, 200 years of land use, 200 years of family obligations, 200 years of customary law that had nothing to do with the legal frameworks being constructed by the new commercial states. When a man could personally recall the founding of a town, he was a problem for any government attempting to claim that the town had always belonged to its sovereign. When a woman could personally recall the original meaning of a boundary stone, she was a problem for any landlord attempting to redraw the boundary in his own favour. The long-lived members of her line were not killed because they were strange. They were killed because they were witnesses. They carried, in living memory, the proof that the official history was a recent invention. She told the doctor that the extermination had been organised in 3 stages. The first stage, between 1680 and 1720, had focused on the elders. The investigators had moved through the valleys with letters of introduction from local nobles, identifying the oldest residents under the pretext of recording folk knowledge or compiling regional surveys, and arranging for those elders to die of natural causes shortly thereafter. The deaths, she said, had been carefully spaced, no more than 2 in a single valley in any given year. No clusters, no patterns, nothing that would have drawn attention. The second stage, between 1720 and 1770, had focused on the middle generations. By this point, the extermination was sufficiently advanced that families had begun to hide their tallest children, to suppress their growth through deliberate undernourishment, to marry them off to shorter outside partners in the hope of reducing the height of the next generation. The investigators responded by tightening their networks, by recruiting local priests and physicians as informants, and by introducing what she called the registry, a system by which every birth in the affected regions was measured at the 3rd day of life, and the largest infants flagged for further attention. The third stage, between 1770 and her own lifetime, had been a mopping up. By 1800, perhaps 50 members of the line remained scattered across half a dozen countries. By 1850, perhaps 15. By the winter of 1879, she was the last. The child in the cradle beside her, she told the doctor, was not her husband's. Her husband had been an ordinary man of ordinary stature, who had married her without knowing what she was, and who had died, she suspected, because the investigators had eventually identified her and had begun to close in. She had concealed the pregnancy because she knew that a registered birth of a child of this size would be a death sentence for both of them. The father of the child, she said, was a man of her own kind, the second to last surviving member of the line, who had visited her on a single night in the spring of the previous year, and had then continued his own journey eastward, and who, she suspected, was now also dead. The child in the cradle was, by her count, the only remaining carrier of the full inheritance. She gave the doctor a small leather pouch containing what she described as the relevant marriage records, the family register going back to 1590, and a list of names. She did not specify what the names referred to. She asked the doctor to take the child and the pouch, and to ensure, in whatever way he could, that the line did not end in that room. And then she gave him the most important part of her statement, the part that Vogel later wrote, in his private letter of 1922, was the reason he never published a word of any of it. She told the doctor the names of the families who had organized the extermination. Not the executioners, who had been minor figures, often replaced. The principals, the men who had funded the registries, who had drafted the legal language by which the long-lived inheritance was reclassified as a medical curiosity rather than a property right, who had ensured that the wealth of the cleared valleys passed quietly into specific banks, specific trading companies, specific holdings that had become, by 1879, the unspoken financial backbone of the European industrial order. She named 11 family names. She named 6 commercial houses. She named 3 banking partnerships. Vogel transcribed all 20 into the register, exactly as she pronounced them. And when he later wrote that he could not publish what he had recorded, he meant specifically those 20 names, because every one of them, in the year 1879, was still in operation, still profiting from the wealth their ancestors had assembled, and still capable of arranging the kind of small, quiet, well-spaced funerals that had buried the witnesses 2 centuries before. The woman died at 4:27 in the afternoon. Vogel recorded the time. He wrapped the infant in clean linen and carried it to the home of his elder sister, a widow who lived alone in a town 14 miles distant, and who had once, many years before, lost an infant of her own, and had never spoken of it. He told his sister only that the mother had died in childbirth, and that the child needed a quiet home where no questions would be asked. His sister took the child without asking any. Vogel returned to the farmhouse the following morning to handle the burial arrangements. He found the farmhouse already attended by 2 men he did not recognize, who introduced themselves as agents of the Regional Sanitary Commission, who were inspecting the property for evidence of contagious disease. They examined the bedroom in which the mother had died. They examined the kitchen. They examined the small upper room in which Vogel had briefly placed the infant before deciding to take it with him. They asked Vogel a number of careful questions about the delivery, the weight of the child, and the disposition of any unusual remains. Vogel told them that the child had been stillborn and that he had taken the body for autopsy and disposal. They asked to see the body. He told them it was already in transit. They asked the name of the colleague who would receive it. He invented a name. They wrote the name down. They thanked him. They left. Within 6 days, the peddler who had ridden for help, the village merchant who had supplied the mother her flour, and the parish clerk who had recorded her marriage in 1864, were all dead of an illness that the local coroner attributed to a sudden epidemic of seasonal influenza. No one else in the surrounding villages contracted it. The deaths were spaced precisely, 2 days apart, then 4 days apart. The pattern was the pattern Aletta Vogel had described from her bedside. Vogel understood. He never spoke of the birth to anyone. He continued his practice. He visited his sister and the child twice a year for the next 18 years, always on different routes, always under different pretexts. The child, whom his sister had named Tobias, grew at a rate that Vogel recorded in a separate small notebook he kept locked in his desk. By the age of 3, Tobias was the size of a tall 8-year-old. By the age of 7, he was the size of a young man. By the age of 12, his sister had moved with him to a remote forestry settlement in the high country, where the boy could work outdoors away from the gaze of any commission or registry. By the age of 18, Tobias was, by Vogel's measurement, 7 feet 4 inches in height, of slow and even temper, of remarkable physical endurance, and of an apparent rate of aging that suggested, by Vogel's careful comparison to other young men of that period, that the boy was developing at roughly 2/3 the normal pace. Vogel never wrote down where Tobias eventually went. In the final entry of the small notebook, dated 1904, Vogel records that the young man had departed for a far country to the east, accompanied by a guide whose name Vogel does not give, and carrying with him the leather pouch that his mother had pressed into the doctor's hands 25 years before. The notebook then goes blank for 18 years. The final document in the file is a letter dated 1922, written by Vogel in his 89th year, addressed to no one in particular, and sealed inside the backboard of his medical register. The letter explains, in the clear handwriting of an old man who has decided that the time for silence is over, that he is depositing the register and all associated materials with an attorney in a city he does not name, with instructions that the entire archive be sealed for a period of 100 years, and then released to a public institution for examination. The letter ends with a single sentence. He writes that the names Aletta Vogel gave him on her deathbed are still, in the year 1922, the names that quietly govern the wealth of the continent, and that he believes the line has survived somewhere, in a place no register can reach, and that someday a child of that line will return to ask why the inheritance was taken, and on that day the world will be required to give an answer it has spent 400 years trying to avoid. The archive was opened in 2022, exactly 100 years after the date of the letter, by the institution to which the attorney's successors had passed the materials. The opening was modest, conducted without press or ceremony, by 3 historians and a librarian. What they found was the original medical register containing the 9 pages of dictation, the small notebook recording the growth of Tobias, the family register going back to 1590, the list of 20 names provided by Aletta Vogel on her deathbed, and the sealed letter of 1922. They found, in addition, a single object that no prior catalogue had mentioned. A small leather pouch, empty but for a folded square of parchment, on which someone had written, in a different hand from any other document in the archive, the words, "The child has gone home." The historians, on examining the list of 20 names, discovered that of the 11 family names provided by Aletta Vogel, 9 still corresponded to active financial entities operating in 2022. Of the 6 commercial houses she named, 4 had merged into modern multinationals whose corporate histories openly trace themselves to the precise houses she identified. Of the 3 banking partnerships she named, 2 are among the oldest continuously operating private banks in Europe, and the third was dissolved in 1998 in a transaction that transferred its assets, under sealed terms, into a holding company registered in a small principality whose financial disclosures are not subject to international audit. Every name on her list, in other words, was either still in operation or had been quietly absorbed into a successor entity in the late 20th century. None of the lineages she identified had disappeared. None of the wealth she described had been redistributed. The structure she described from her deathbed in 1879 remained, in its essential outline, the structure of European private capital in the present day. Among the materials in the archive, the historians also found a folded sheet of paper that had been tucked into the spine of the family register. It was a copy, in Aletta Vogel's own handwriting, of what she described as the founding instruction of the registry system. The original document, she noted, had been drafted in 1687 by a committee of 3 men, whose names she did not provide on this sheet, although she had spoken them aloud to the doctor at her bedside. The instruction laid out, in 3 short paragraphs, the procedure by which infants in certain designated districts were to be measured at the 3rd day of life. The measurement was to include the length of the femur from hip to knee, the circumference of the skull at the brow line, and the total weight on a standard balance kept at the parish office. Any infant whose measurements exceeded specified thresholds was to be reported to the regional commissioner within 7 days. The commissioner was instructed to forward the report, with a small fee enclosed, to a central office in a city Aletta Vogel did not name in the copied document, but had named at her bedside. The central office, the instruction explained, would then determine the appropriate disposition of the case. The word disposition was underlined in the copy. Aletta Vogel had added, in her own hand at the bottom of the sheet, a single annotation. She wrote that in the language of the original instruction, disposition meant one of three things. The child could be enrolled in a fostering arrangement that removed it from its family and placed it in a religious institution where its growth could be monitored. The child could be subjected to what the document described as therapeutic intervention, a category that included the deliberate administration of substances known to interfere with skeletal development. Or the child could be returned to the keeping of the original holder, a euphemism that, Aletta Vogel wrote, no member of her line had ever survived. The registry continued in operation, according to the family records, for almost 200 years. It was not a single agency. It was a network of overlapping local arrangements, each one anchored to a parish priest, a regional physician, or a town clerk who received a modest annual stipend in exchange for forwarding the relevant measurements. The principals in the central offices changed over generations. The families who funded the central offices did not. The mechanism was, in Aletta Vogel's careful description, the first modern data collection program in European history. It worked precisely because no one in the affected districts knew it existed. Parents who carried their newborns to the parish office for the routine third-day blessing did not know that the priest was also measuring the child with a folding rule kept in his sleeve. Aletta Vogel told the doctor that her own grandmother had been a child of the registry. The grandmother had been born in 1807 in a high valley in the central mountains, had been measured at the third day of life by a parish priest who had then forwarded the report, and had been spirited away in the night by her own parents before the regional commissioner could arrive. The family had crossed 3 borders in 6 weeks. They had changed their name twice. They had settled finally in a remote agricultural region, where the grandmother had grown to her full height of 7 feet 11 inches and had lived to the age of 127. The grandmother had been the source of most of what Aletta Vogel now repeated from her bedside. By the time Aletta Vogel was born in 1845, the family network was reduced to perhaps a dozen surviving members across 4 countries, communicating through coded letters carried by trusted couriers, marrying as necessary into shorter outside lineages to disguise their inheritance, and watching, year by year, as their numbers thinned and the registries followed. The doctor recorded all of this in the same patient script he had used for the original 9 pages. He recorded the precise spelling of names that Aletta Vogel pronounced in 3 different languages. He recorded the locations of 3 burial grounds where, she told him, members of her line had been quietly interred under false markers. He recorded, finally, the name of a single contact in a distant eastern city, a man who had been a friend of the grandmother and who, if approached by a member of the line carrying the family register, would understand what to do. The doctor delivered the name and the address to his sister, who carried them, 18 years later, on the journey east that her foster son Tobias would eventually complete on his own. Whether Tobias found the contact, the archive does not say. The final entry of the small notebook simply records that the young man departed, that the leather pouch went with him, and that the doctor returned to his practice with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had completed a task entrusted to him a quarter-century earlier by a dying woman who had spent her last 40 minutes refusing, with extraordinary calm, to let her line die in the room with her. The historians did what historians do. They wrote a careful, measured paper. They circulated it to a small academic journal. The paper was rejected. They rewrote it with fewer specifics. It was rejected again. They sent it to a press. The press declined to publish. They posted a summary online. The summary was removed by the hosting service within 72 hours for reasons that were never clearly explained. The full archive remains, as of the present moment, in the possession of the institution to which it was bequeathed, and is technically available to qualified researchers, although the researchers who have requested access since 2023 have, in each documented case, been informed that the archive is undergoing conservation and is temporarily unavailable for consultation. Aletta Vogel died at 27 minutes past 4 on a winter afternoon in 1879. She spent her last 40 minutes describing the mechanism by which an entire branch of the human family had been quietly removed from the historical record, so that the wealth it had carried could be reassigned to a small number of houses, whose names still appear, in 2026 on the boards of central banks, on the trustee lists of major museums, on the donor walls of universities that teach a version of European history in which her people are not mentioned. Her child, by every available indication, survived. The line, by every available indication, did not end in that farmhouse. Dr. Henrik Vogel kept his promise. He carried what she gave him for 43 years. He died in his sleep in his 90th year, in the same village where he had practiced for over 60 years, having never told another living soul what was written in the back of his register, and having arranged, with the patience of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, for that register to surface in a century when the names she had spoken would still be the names that needed to be answered for. What we are left with is not a folk tale and not a curiosity. We are left with a deathbed statement, transcribed in real time by a sober and meticulous physician, supported by a family register going back nearly 3 centuries, corroborated by the documented deaths of 3 peripheral witnesses within days of the birth, and confirmed in its essential historical claim by the continued existence of every named principle in modern European finance. We are left with the small leather pouch, found empty in 2022, with its single line of writing in an unknown hand. The child has gone home. We do not know where home was. We do not know whether home still exists. We do not know whether the line Aletta Vogel preserved has descendants walking among us, taller than the rest of us, slower to age, quieter than the records around them, waiting for a moment when the names she gave the doctor can finally be spoken out loud. What we know is that a country doctor was called to a farmhouse on a winter afternoon in 1879, and that what he carried home with him in the inner pocket of his greatcoat has been waiting, in a sealed register, for 147 years, for someone to listen. If this account left you with a feeling that you have been told a smaller version of history than the one that actually happened, share with someone you know who is still willing to ask uncomfortable questions, because the truth survives only as long as people are willing to carry it down from the farmhouse and into the next century. We will see you in the next one.